Hi there. This is my new goofy look, and today we're going to talk about truth and understanding of truth. Um, in media literacy, one thing to understand about truth is that it's first of all based in language, and of course based in the way that the media would frame that language for us, and all truth therefore is embedded in our understanding of this framing. For example, these days we frequently hear the words, inflation is up. Actually, we don't always realize something about this. Both inflation and up are metaphors, and our language is full of them. We often don't recognize how they can help make meanings of things that are really not metaphoric at all. So we pay more for something, but we must relate the process to a picture in our minds. And that picture is one of loading, and up means things will cost more. So there's nothing vertical about this whole process, and yet you will see that, for example, higher is a higher cost is up, north is up, good is up, happy is up, and similarly, south is down, bad is down, sad is down, and of course, lower price is down. It's like marketer's map, right? Like, so you see north, and for some reason it's always up, and then and south is always down. Similarly, if I said high culture, would you mistake that for highly cultured, which leads you to the imagination of this very straight-jacketed person speaking in a supposedly very sophisticated accent? Or would you imagine it as Hofstede meant it, which is Hofstede, Hofstede. In the 1970s, he brought out this whole framework of high cultures and low cultures. And in Hofstede's cultural paradigm, the United States is low culture because it accords lower importance to cultural norms than, for example, Iran, which is high culture because it does the opposite. It accords high importance to cultural norms. So this metaphorization of our language is very important for us to understand how truth works. So at first we understand the paradigm or the framework that somebody sets for us, then we understand the linguistic elements of the framework, then we create our real meanings within that linguistic framework. That is that our reality emanates from that framework. And of course, our reality meaning how we construct our world. One of the most fundamental aspects of media consumption is knowing how we know what we know. That is the process of understanding this process of understanding. So for example, when we say we watch a fantasy movie, we understand it's a figment of our imagination. But when we watch news, we presume we are watching the truth or facts. So what happens when those presumptions are challenged? That is the test of our understanding of our world, right? And usually understanding is not that simple. It is the process between the message and the meaning. That basically is what we can call understanding. Media theory terms, we might call it interpretation or meaning making. And it is this space that brings us together. It is that space we need to kind of demystify in this class. So George Lakoff is best known for his theory that we make meanings of our world by attaching those meanings to something else we understand, just like we said. Lakoff wrote a book along with Mark Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. It's a breezy but very deep treatise on meaning making. And this presumes the idea that we make meaning of our world through language, and the assumption that we make in media literacy is pretty much the same thing. After all, what is literacy without language? So in audio-visual media, they have something called the grammar of production, which basically means that they make images and add text to it, and there's a certain grammar to both the visual as well as the words. So when you, for example, would be making an Instagram reel or whatever they call it, you would use this kind of grammar. I mean, you can construct your own grammar, but you use grammar, and that is what you expect your viewer to use. You're translating not just the content, but also the form and the format in that video that you actually make. And that's the kind of thing that a filmmaker or a news journalist hopes that they would be understood. Let's take the term war on drugs, right? Like, this was a term that was invented by President Richard Nixon in 1971 for what would then become a global movement, of which the United States would be a pioneer. This is from Lakoff and Johnson's book. This is a metaphor, right? Like, what is it about a war that clicks into place in our minds as this aggressive, proactive measure to stop an undesired movement of something? So it's like that with sports as well, but also more with war. And that it's concerning to me that war should be something that actually embeds meanings into our minds of something that's not a war. So let's push for something that's closer to where we are right now than Richard Nixon, maybe President George W. Bush, who famously launched what he called the War on Terror. This war was different to the extent that we might think it's merely a metaphor, but really, when there's an actual military offensive, the classic definition of a war, we're not all that surprised. Like, that goes with the metaphor of war, the invasion of Iraq, for example. So what forms of invocation are happening here? The invocation of war on terror is also an invocation of nationalism, which is great for governments because it makes people agree. There's a consensus that's at the end of that road. Human rights is another concept that seems to be universal and undeniable. So think of meanings in those kinds of frameworks. Similarly, when the COVID pandemic struck, governments around the world took the opportunity to push various messages that were not necessarily to do with the pandemic itself. Vaccines are good, lives are important. In a different context, we are told that we must push people to take the vaccine because unless 67% of us receive the vaccine, we cannot achieve what's called herd immunity. And these are statistics, and so are we. Like, side effects are a statistical minority. The government doesn't tell us this, but it wants us to understand that a small percentage of people adversely affected by the vaccine are the people even dying from clots in their hearts or whatever. That might be the result of statistics. That might be the result of the vaccine, but this small percentage is not of significance. The people, of course, are statistically insignificant in a crisis that demands that all of us become those statistics. So governments really, they have to play that game as hard as it might be for them. And governments seem to have determined that we are not literate enough to understand how our becoming mere numbers is actually important in that larger picture. So they will not tell us that we are actual numbers, but they will tell us that vaccines are good. So governments now, by hiding certain facts about a vaccine, herd immunity is therefore achieved. And therefore, that is what ultimately is good for everybody, at least most of us. So something else happened here. Governments use this pandemic as an opportunity to sell the government's politics to us. For example, in India, the government introduced a daily health bulletin, much on the lines of what we might find in Anthony Fauci's bulletin, opinions and so on and so forth. In it, in that Indian government's daily health bulletins from the health ministry, the senior bureaucrat who would appear every evening with some updates soon began using that time to talk about how the Indian ventilator industry took advantage of the pandemic and became a significant business. It became a nationalistic machinery to tell us how good India was doing in handling the pandemic, but also how Indian government was pushing livelihoods because the Indian ventilator industry had taken advantage and become a great business. The bureaucrat, whose name is Rajesh Bhushan, said, and this is in translation, that the industrialists and innovators turned the COVID situation into an opportunity and successfully established a homegrown ventilator industry. He went on to add, quote, "The biggest news this week is that we have conducted 20 million tests." And then he said, "The number of recovered cases is more than double the active cases," unquote. Remember that all this is mediated. The media ran all this live. Most of the media also ran actual statistical facts, however, on maybe on a split screen or something of that sort, if it was on television, or further down in the story, if it was in a newspaper or digital story. These statistical facts, however, were so much in contrast and so startling that they conflicted with the positive messaging that the government was trying to do, much to sometimes the ridicule of critics who said that this is the government trying its antics at us. And this problem is by no means exclusive to India, and whether this was a communicative problem or the problem of narrative building, which was kind of exposed in the media, we won't know, or we won't debate. At least the US and India, for example, have the most number of COVID-19 cases. And mixed messages have only confounded or confused our understanding of the crisis. In 2020, there was something called the Ig Nobel Prizes for medical education. These global satirical awards for the worst invention and ideas almost predictably went to Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India and US President Donald Trump. But also to the Prime Minister of the UK, presidents of Brazil, Russia, Turkey, Belarus, Mexico, Turkmenistan, for what it said was, quote, "teaching the world that politicians can have a more immediate impact on life and death than scientists and doctors can." Is there a certain obfuscation, a clouding of different concepts here? An emotion is being projected as something that's objective, an emotion that may be ignored in this process. Like the government is using emotion to get at facts. Lakoff and Johnson call this a vehicle of imaginative nationality. I don't know, we might even call it imaginary nationality, because a vehicle of imaginative rationality, sorry, not nationality. And we might call it an imaginary rationality because if you dig deeper, rationality sometimes is the interrupter into our irrational human trait. And so rationality is being marketed as this good thing, and sometimes it fails to understand the world is not that rational, it's irrational, right? So anyway, so we understand these bits and pieces of these obfuscations and manipulations, and we may argue that we all float in the sea of uncertainty between media illiteracy and media literacy. In other words, we are all semi-literate. We're just floating in this sea of uncertainty. Nobody is linguistically literate completely, and completely illiterate except the toddler who just learned their first word. Similarly, a media literate person understands this obfuscation, but what should this person do with that understanding? Can media literacy prescribe how you should use it? That is to say, can someone else define an objective truth for you? Are there merely subjective truths that are based on how we make meanings? I'd like you to think about that, if you would, and whether we live in objective or subjective worlds, we live in our experiences. So there's a way we can define our world simply in the ways that we experience it. And in fact, the feedback, the kind of discussions we will be holding in this class will speak to that. I would really like you to explain your world based on your experience rather than the theories that we are telling you. But learn from us these theories and kind of apply them to how you experience the world. So a chapter or an excerpt from Lakoff's and Johnson's book is included in this week's packet. And you know, I hope you enjoy reading that. And also I hope to indulge you in that discussion that we're going to have this week. And see how we can kind of deconstruct our world as much as we can this week for ourselves. Thank you very much. It's great talking to you. I look forward to our discussion this week.